Did you
The
hear
night
about
is
the new
silent,
arrivals?
save for the creak of old wood and the distant toll of a bell
They
that
say they're from
refuses
a
to tell
distant
whether it
land.
belongs to the living or the dead. Somewhere in the forgotten countryside, hidden behind heavy forests and walls of stone, there once stood a house that breathed only in whispers. Its inhabitants were not like others of their time. They did not retreat to feather beds at dusk, nor did they light fires for warmth and comfort. Instead, when the moon rose high and the shadows lengthened across their cold halls, the family gathered in silence, crossing themselves, as though warding off something unseen. One by one, they stepped into coffins, polished oak, lined with velvet, some bearing the family crest in brass. With deliberate care they lay down inside them, as though rehearsing their deaths night after night, waiting for lids that never quite shut. And there they would sleep, not because they wished to, but because they believed it was the only way to outwit a curse that clung to their bloodline like ivy, wrapping itself around a dying tower. The image is almost unbearable to imagine. Wealthy lords and noble ladies, heirs to a powerful dynasty, lying motionless in coffins of their own design. Their chests rose and fell with shallow breaths, their faces pale in candlelight, their hands crossed over their chests, as though already presented for burial. Servants dared not disturb them. Strangers who came to the estate left shaken, whispering of what they had seen. Some swore that the air in those rooms was heavier, as though the house itself were half buried in the grave. For the family, this strange ritual was not some morbid indulgence. It was a desperate pact with death itself. Sleep in the coffin, become as the dead, and perhaps death would overlook you, passing by in search of another victim. To understand why they chose such an existence, we must first recognize the world in which they lived, a time when curses were not only whispered but feared, when strange deaths could not be explained by science, and when the boundary between superstition and survival was perilously thin. Their dynasty, once noble and commanding, was marked from its earliest years by tragedy. Children perished before reaching adulthood. Sons fell in battle, or were claimed by inexplicable illnesses. Daughters were said to wander in fevered madness, muttering of specters in the halls. The pattern was too precise, too relentless. Generations ended abruptly, branches of the family tree withered as though cut by an invisible hand. To the outside world, it appeared cursed. To those within, it felt inevitable. Imagine the dread of being born into such a house, where from your first breath you are told that your blood is tainted, that death lingers close. Imagine walking down a corridor lined with portraits of your ancestors, each painted in youth, because so few lived to old age. Imagine the whispers in the village beyond the gates, that your family was doomed, touched by the devil, punished for sins long buried. Every cough, every fever, every accident fed the legend. Every funeral bell reinforced it. For the dynasty, there was no ordinary life, only an endless struggle against the shadow that had attached itself to their name. It was in this atmosphere of dread that the coffin ritual was born. No one can say for certain when the first member of the family lowered themselves into a coffin, not meant for burial. Some claimed it was a patriarch who, after losing 3 children in a single year, demanded that his remaining sons sleep in coffins to confuse the reaper. Others whispered it began with a widow driven mad by grief, who refused to leave her husband's casket, and whose descendants took her obsession as a form of protection. Whatever its origin, the practice spread through the household until it became nightly routine. Coffins were no longer symbols of endings, but instruments of survival. For outsiders, the thought was grotesque. To the family, it was simply life. They would host dinners and political gatherings by day, but when the sun dipped below the horizon, the masquerade of normalcy ended. Guests, if unlucky enough to remain in the house overnight, described the horror of watching candles snuffed out, and the noblemen and women retreating into their coffins with solemn precision. They did not call it ritual, they called it necessity, for if they did not submit to it, they believed the curse would claim them before dawn. Legends spread quickly beyond the estate walls. Villagers spoke of seeing faint lights flickering from windows long after midnight, of hearing strange hymns sung under breath, of shadows moving behind curtains where no one should be awake. Some believed the family were vampires, hiding their true nature behind coffins rather than graves. Others thought they were heretics, consorting with death to gain unnatural life. And yet those who had seen the family up close swore they were still human, frightened, fragile, but undeniably alive. What terrified people most was not that the dynasty was something other than human, but that they were human enough to choose such a life, to willingly embrace the coffin in hopes of outwitting fate. As the years passed, the story of the coffin sleepers grew, tangled in rumor and fear. Children dared each other to walk near the gates at night. Priests warned their congregations of the dangers of sin and curses. Even scholars began to take note, their writings tinged with disbelief and fascination. And yet through all the whispers and all the theories, one question persisted: could such a ritual truly ward off death, or was it nothing more than a performance of despair? The dynasty itself left no answer. All that remained were the accounts of those who glimpsed their way of life, fragments of memory preserved in diaries and letters, and the chilling image of noble figures lying in coffins, alive but not living, suspended between existence and oblivion. That is where our story begins, with a family so desperate to survive their curse that they chose to mimic the grave, night after night, until their entire legacy was defined not by their power, but by the coffins they left behind. They were not always a family of shadows. Long before the coffins, before whispers of curses seeped into their walls, this dynasty was known for brilliance, ambition, and wealth that could rival kings. To their contemporaries, they were not a doomed house, but a rising star. The land they ruled stretched wide across fertile valleys and dark forests, the kind of territory that fed both power and fear. They built estates of stone that seemed unshakable, decorated with spires that clawed to the heavens, as if daring the sky itself to deny them greatness. In portraits from those days, you see faces marked not with dread, but with pride, eyes steady, gazes that suggested they believed their name would never fade. They were patrons of art, music, and religion. In chapels, their coats of arms glittered in stained glass. Minstrels sang of their triumphs, and peasants, though often oppressed by their rule, still recognized their lords as figures touched by destiny. To be born into their house was to inherit not only wealth, but a place in history. Even monarchs courted their loyalty, for they commanded armies as easily as they hosted banquets. In the eyes of their rivals, they seemed untouchable, blessed rather than cursed. And yet, even amid the golden glow of their ascendancy, there were signs, small cracks in the facade, faint as hairline fractures in marble. A child struck by fever, gone before their portrait could be painted. A young bride found lifeless in her chambers, her lips pale, her skin cold, though no cause could be named. To outsiders, these were tragedies that could strike any house. To the family, though, such losses lingered in memory, unspoken but never forgotten. The dynasty's rise was built not only on power but on secrets. The land they acquired was not always won through treaties and marriages. Sometimes it was seized through war, through betrayals, through the kind of quiet violence that nobles prefer not to record in their ledgers. There were whispers, even in their early days, that the family's founder had made a pact of blood, a vow sealed in midnight rituals far from the church's gaze. Some said their fortune came too swiftly, too completely to be natural, but in times of triumph, people are quick to forget such rumors. The dynasty grew rich, and the rumors faded into the background like smoke after a fire. Imagine their estates during those peak years, banquet halls lit by 100 candles, goblets overflowing with wine, servants bustling in endless procession. Music echoed off stone walls, and laughter carried into the night. To walk into such a house was to be overwhelmed by abundance. The family's heraldry, sigils carved into doors, embroidered into fabrics, etched into silver, reminded all who entered that this was a name meant to last forever. And yet, beneath that glamour, a certain coldness lingered. Guests often remarked that for all their splendor, there was something uneasy in the air, something that suggested joy was fragile, laughter forced, as if even then, shadows stretched just beyond the edges of the firelight. for history has a way of dressing its tragedies in splendor before tearing it away. The more powerful they became, the more their misfortunes grew difficult to ignore. Entire branches of the family seemed struck down in their youth. Sons who should have inherited titles perished before they could reach manhood. Daughters meant to marry into other noble houses fell ill, their dowries returned, their futures erased. Servants whispered of the mark on the family, bad luck so consistent it could not be coincidence. And still the dynasty pressed forward, determined to drown grief in ceremony and grandeur. The paradox was haunting. The greater their glory, the deeper their losses. They hosted feasts, even as funerals multiplied. Their halls echoed with song even as their crypts filled with coffins. Every celebration seemed shadowed by mourning, yet they refused to retreat. To the world they presented the face of resilience, insisting that misfortune would not define them. Inside the estate, though, fear was growing like rot beneath polished wood. Generations are often remembered by the monuments they leave behind. For this dynasty, those monuments stood tall: cathedrals, statues, libraries filled with illuminated manuscripts. But their legacy was always shadowed by what could not be written, the sense that their greatness came at a terrible cost. Peasants in nearby villages spoke of their rulers with both awe and suspicion. They were respected, yes, even feared, but rarely loved. Too much tragedy followed them. Too many coffins lowered into the earth. And so, as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, their story began to shift. What had once been seen as isolated tragedies began to form a pattern. Chroniclers began to notice the sheer number of deaths, the uncanny regularity with which misfortune struck them. Whispers of a curse, once muttered only in the shadows of taverns, now crept into sermons, into letters, even into rival courts. This was not just another noble family, it was a dynasty haunted by something no wealth or power could keep at bay. Still, they clung to their dignity. To admit the existence of a curse would have been to surrender it, and so they fought it with the only weapons they had: faith, ritual, and denial. They continued to build, to wed, to govern, as though the ground beneath them was not already crumbling. Yet every heir who looked upon the portraits of their ancestors knew, in their heart of hearts, that their story was not like other houses. Their line had begun in light, but darkness was closing in, slow and inevitable, like the toll of a distant bell that could not be silenced. And so the stage was set, a dynasty born in glory, crowned with triumph, but already touched by death, a house that seemed destined to stand forever, yet whose foundations trembled with every passing generation. They had reached their height, but their true legacy, the one that would define them for centuries to come, was only just beginning. Every curse begins with a whisper. At first, it is no more than a rumor carried by frightened voices, a superstition muttered when candles gutter low, or when the earth trembles under a storm. But in this dynasty's history, the whisper grew into a story so persistent, so chilling, that even centuries later, it clings to their memory like cobwebs in an abandoned hall. The first signs of darkness emerged, not during famine or plague, when death stalked all households, but in times of relative peace, when misfortune seemed most unnatural. The dynasty's patriarch, his name preserved in both official records and whispered folklore, had secured lands through war and diplomacy, building a foundation that seemed unshakable. Yet it was his children who bore the first marks of the curse. One account, preserved in a servant's diary, speaks of a boy no older than 10. He was described as bright, spirited, the pride of the family's future. One morning, he was seen playing in the courtyard, chasing a wooden hoop. By nightfall, he was dead. No wound, no illness had been noticed. The physician could offer no cause beyond a sudden weakness of the heart. The family buried him in silence, but the villagers took note. Healthy children did not simply collapse. Soon after, a second child was lost, this time a daughter, only 12 years old. She was said to have woken screaming in the middle of the night, clutching at her chest, her eyes wide with terror, as though she had seen something no one else could. Her cries echoed through the halls until they fell silent forever. Once again, the family summoned priests and physicians, desperate for answers. None could be found. Natural afflictions, the priests declared. God's will. But the household servants, whose whispers reached the village, claimed she had shouted a single word before death took her shadow. By the third death, the whispers could no longer be ignored. This time, it was the patriarch's own brother, a man in his prime, who was found lifeless at his writing desk. The candle still burned beside him, illuminating pages half filled with ink. Some say the words scratched on that final page were smeared, illegible, as though his hand had frozen mid-sentence. Others claimed they could make out fragments, references to visions, to debts, to something that waited in the dark. Whether true or not, those fragments became fuel for the curse's legend. With each loss, fear grew, both within the estate and beyond its walls. The family insisted these tragedies were misfortune, nothing more. But villagers, watching from a distance, began to weave their own narrative. They spoke of a pact made by the family's founder, a bargain struck in blood during wartime. According to these tales, victory had not been won by sword or strategy alone, but by invoking forces best left unnamed. He sold the future for the present, the villagers whispered. And now the children pay the price. Folklore is quick to feed on tragedy, and soon stories spread of strange occurrences tied to the house. A nursemaid claimed to hear footsteps in empty corridors at night. A stable boy swore he saw the reflection of a pale child in the pond, though no one stood there. Bells in the family chapel were said to toll without human hands to ring them. Each story added weight to the curse's reputation, until the dynasty's name was spoken with unease. What made the stories so powerful was their timing. This was an age when science had not yet untangled the mysteries of illness, when sudden death seemed as likely to be witchcraft as it was disease. Superstition filled the gaps left by ignorance. And when a family so powerful, so untouchable, was struck down again and again, people did not ask what herbs might cure them. They asked what sins they had committed. The family itself seemed divided. Some clung to faith, filling chapels with prayers, commissioning masses for the dead. Others turned inward, burying their grief in silence. There were even whispers that certain members, desperate to break the cycle, sought out forbidden remedies, consulting wise women, dabbling in charms, clinging to any hope of protection. Whether these efforts ever occurred or were inventions of gossip, they deepened the air of mystery surrounding the house. By the time the patriarch himself grew old, the dynasty's reputation had shifted. What once was remembered for triumph was now shadowed by loss. Neighbors regarded them not with envy but with dread, as though their misfortunes might spread like a contagion. Servants hesitated to remain in their employ, fearing they too might be marked by the curse. Even marriages, once easy to arrange thanks to their wealth, grew difficult. Other noble houses hesitated to join their bloodline, wary of tying themselves to death. And yet, despite the mounting tragedies, the dynasty endured. They buried their dead with solemn processions, sealed crypts with heavy stones, and pressed forward as though sheer determination could erase the shadow. But history remembers the whispers, not the resilience. For every child lost, for every unexplained death, the legend of the curse grew darker, richer, until it was no longer possible to separate truth from tale. Some said the curse was vengeance, a punishment for the founder's violent conquests. Others claimed it was divine wrath, sent by God to humble the proud. Still others whispered of darker forces, of bargains made in secret chambers, of debts that could never be repaid. Each theory added a new layer to the story, but all agreed on one point: this was no ordinary misfortune. Something lingered in the blood of the dynasty, something that could not be outlasted. It is from this atmosphere, half grief, half superstition, that the coffin ritual would one day emerge. The family could not control death, but perhaps they could learn to deceive it. Long before they lay themselves in coffins, they lived in fear of the curse that had already claimed so many, and as each generation buried its dead, the whisper became a certainty: theirs was a name marked not for glory, but for the grave. There are tragedies that strike once, leaving scars but allowing life to continue. And then there are patterns, relentless, merciless, repeating themselves with such precision that they no longer seem like coincidence. For the dynasty, death became less an intruder and more a permanent resident. Their lives were not punctuated by the occasional funeral, but defined by them. Every new generation stepped into a cycle they could neither break nor understand, a plague of premature deaths that hollowed out their family tree branch by branch. The first wave was spoken of in whispers, children gone before they had a chance to grow, siblings lost within months of one another. But as years stretched into decades, the pattern sharpened. Rarely did an heir live beyond their 30th year. Rarely did a marriage remain unbroken by early widowhood. Physicians were summoned again and again, their treatments shifting with the fashions of medicine, leeches, herbs, purgatives, even the new practices of bleeding, but none could explain why strong young men collapsed suddenly, why brides with rosy cheeks wasted away into pale specters, why infants were born already gasping for breath. The records we have, letters, chronicles, fragments preserved in dusty archives, are chilling not because they describe single disasters, but because they describe the same disaster repeated endlessly. One generation loses 2 sons in battle, the next both heirs die of fever before they can inherit. A daughter collapses on her wedding day, her veil pulled over her lifeless face, as though it had always been a shroud. A young lord celebrated for his strength falls from his horse in a hunt, not from recklessness, but from what witnesses called a seizure of terror, his body convulsing before he struck the ground. Each story is different in detail, but identical in its end. The villagers outside the estate walls began to mark their calendars, not by festivals or harvests, but by funerals. Bells tolled so often that their sound lost the weight of shock, becoming instead a grim rhythm of life. Another of them, peasants would murmur as black processions wound down the road. The curse has taken another. Children grew up never knowing a time when the dynasty's crypt did not echo with new arrivals. For the villagers, it became not only history but proof that death itself favored their rulers, proof that wealth and power offered no protection when one's blood was poisoned by fate. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was heavier still. Imagine living in a house where each chamber carries memory of loss, where portraits hang not as tributes to longevity, but as reminders of how young each face had been when death claimed it. Servants grew superstitious, performing small rituals of their own, leaving sprigs of herbs at the thresholds, whispering prayers as they polished candelabras, refusing to linger in rooms where too many had died. Guests, when they came, remarked on the strange silence of the place. Even laughter seemed muffled, as though the walls themselves absorbed joy before it could spread. The dynasty tried to fight back against the tide. They built chapels, commissioned masses, filled their estates with holy relics in hopes of warding off evil. Priests walked their corridors at night, sprinkling holy water on doors and beds, muttering blessings against unseen forces. Some turned to medicine, inviting renowned physicians from distant cities to diagnose their misfortunes. Others turned to secrecy, quietly consulting mystics, alchemists, and wise women who promised protection for a price. Still, nothing worked. No matter what rituals or remedies they employed, the funerals continued. Over time, the deaths themselves became stranger, more grotesque, as though the curse grew hungrier. One account tells of a bride who, the night before her wedding, complained of a shadow at her window. By morning she was found dead, her body unmarked, her face frozen in terror. Another speaks of a young boy who refused to sleep, insisting a figure stood at the foot of his bed each night. Exhaustion eventually overcame him, and he never woke again. There were whispers of madness too, family members who raved about hearing whispers in the corridors, who clawed at their own skin as though trying to peel something away, who ended their lives before the curse could do it for them. And still, the dynasty endured. Each new heir was raised under the shadow of expectation, knowing from birth that their time would likely be short. Imagine growing up in such a world, birthdays not celebrated with joy, but with dread. Each passing year a reminder that you had outlived another cousin, another sibling, another ancestor. The very act of living became a gamble. Some heirs turned reckless, throwing themselves into hunts, duels, or wars, as if daring death to come sooner. Others turned reclusive, shutting themselves in their chambers, surrounding themselves with relics and prayers, hoping solitude could shield them. But the curse claimed both equally. By the 17th century, their reputation was sealed. Chroniclers began to write of them not as a noble house but as a doomed one, their names synonymous with tragedy. Rival families spoke of them with a mix of pity and satisfaction, using the curse as a cautionary tale about ambition and sin. Even allies grew distant, unwilling to risk their blood mingling with a lineage so marked by death. Marriage alliances collapsed, fortunes dwindled and isolation deepened. The dynasty, once surrounded by admirers and allies, found itself increasingly alone, a house filled with coffins rather than heirs. And yet, through all of this, the family refused to surrender. They held to their rituals, their faith, their determination to outlast the curse. But behind the determination was desperation, a gnawing fear that no matter how many prayers they uttered or doctors they summoned, their fate was already written. Each new birth was celebrated with trembling hands, each new heir baptized not with hope but with dread, for everyone knew the pattern. No one lived long. It was in this crucible of endless loss that the coffin ritual would finally take root. Death had taken too much, too often, too predictably. If they could not stop it, perhaps they could deceive it. If death sought the living, then let them appear dead. If the curse demanded coffins, then let them climb inside on their own terms. What began as funerals multiplied until it became lifestyle, until the line between living and dead blurred. For the dynasty, the plague of premature deaths was not merely history. It was destiny, one they would do anything to escape, even if it meant sleeping each night in the embrace of the grave. It began as an act of desperation, whispered in the dark, a ritual born not from faith, but from fear. For generations, the dynasty had buried its children, its heirs, its brides, and its patriarchs, watching their lineage wither like a tree poisoned at the roots. Priests had offered prayers, doctors had prescribed remedies, and still the funerals came. By the time the curse had claimed nearly every branch of their bloodline, the family stood at the edge of ruin, and it was then, in the suffocating grip of despair, that they turned to the unthinkable. The first account of the practice is as vague as it is chilling. A chronicler, writing in the early 17th century, noted that those of the house who still lived lay themselves nightly into their own coffins, believing such mimicry of death might shield them from the fate of their kin. The entry is brief, almost casual, but the weight of its meaning is staggering. No longer were coffins reserved for the dead. They became beds for the living. Imagine the moment when that decision was first spoken aloud. Perhaps it was a father, watching yet another child lowered into the earth, who swore he would not meet the same fate. Perhaps it was a widow, inconsolable, who refused to leave her husband's coffin and instead chose to lie within it, night after night, until the rest of her family began to follow. However it began, what matters is that it spread, transforming from eccentricity into ritual. By dusk, the lords and ladies of the house did not retreat to warm feather mattresses. They entered coffins lined with velvet and silk, their lids left ajar so they might breathe, and there they lay until dawn. The symbolism was as grim as it was deliberate. To lie in a coffin was to embrace death before it could claim you. To appear dead was to confuse the reaper, to convince whatever force haunted the family that its victims had already been taken. If death was inevitable, then they would rehearse it endlessly, hoping to gain mastery over it. In their minds, the coffin became not a trap, but a shield. For the servants, the sight was unbearable. Imagine being a maid or a footman, carrying a candle through the halls after nightfall, opening the door to a bedchamber, and finding your master stretched motionless in a coffin. Their faces pale in the flickering light, their hands folded across their chests, their breaths shallow, almost imperceptible. They looked less like the living than corpses awaiting burial. Many servants left, unable to endure the nightly terror. Others stayed but refused to enter the bedchambers after dusk, speaking of the family as half dead already. Visitors to the estate recorded their shock with equal unease. One letter from a traveling nobleman described being offered a guest room, only to find that the chamber contained not a bed, but a coffin. Horrified, he fled the estate before sunrise, writing that the family consorted with the grave in ways unholy and unnatural. Others whispered that the dynasty had embraced vampirism, that they lay in coffins not to avoid death, but to feed upon it, drawing some twisted strength from the ritual. But the family themselves insisted otherwise. To them, it was survival, nothing more. During the day, they dressed in finery, attended to politics, hosted dinners, and performed the duties expected of nobility. But when the sun sank below the horizon, the masquerade ended. Death was always waiting, and the coffin was their only refuge. The practice grew increasingly elaborate over time. At first, they may have used plain wooden coffins, the kind any villager might be buried in. But as the ritual solidified, the coffins became ornate, crafted by the finest carpenters, adorned with the family crest, padded with silk, lined with velvet. Some were said to be fitted with small compartments to hold relics, rosaries, or vials of holy water. Others were rumored to contain charms against evil, carved symbols hidden beneath the fabric. Each coffin was personal, both bed and tomb, carried with its owner from one estate to another like a grotesque piece of luggage. This transformation turned their home into something uncanny. Bedrooms resembled crypts, corridors echoed with the faint smell of wood and wax, and the boundary between living quarters and burial chambers disappeared entirely. Guests who dared to stay overnight reported hearing the creak of coffin lids in the darkness, the shuffle of feet as members of the family slid themselves into place, the suffocating silence that followed as the house descended into a performance of death. Psychologically, the toll was immense. Children of the dynasty grew up, not in nurseries but beside coffins. From their earliest years, they were taught to step inside, to cross their arms over their chests, to lie still, as though already dead. Sleep was no longer a time of rest, but a nightly ritual of surrender. What dreams could such children have known? How could they grow without absorbing the belief that death was always at their bedside, watching, waiting? The villagers, meanwhile, had no shortage of explanations. Some claimed the family was cursed by the souls of those they had wronged, peasants driven from their land, rivals betrayed, blood spilled in forgotten wars. Others swore it was the devil himself, claiming payment for the founder's bargain. A few even believed the dynasty had chosen the curse willingly, trading ordinary life for a twisted form of longevity, their nightly coffin ritual, a pact to prolong existence by pretending to relinquish it. Whatever the truth, the image of the coffin sleepers spread like wildfire. Rumors carried their story across villages, cities, even neighboring countries. Poets invoked them in verses, playwrights hinted at them in tragedies, and preachers warned congregations of the dangers of consorting with death. By the time their reputation had spread far and wide, the dynasty was no longer remembered as patrons of art or rulers of vast lands. They were remembered only as those who chose to sleep in coffins, the cursed family that rehearsed death nightly. And the strangest part, for a time, the ritual seemed to work. The relentless pace of premature deaths slowed, as if the curse itself had been tricked into believing its victims already claimed. Some heirs lived into their 40s, even their 50s, an age almost unheard of in their bloodline. The family seized upon this as proof, clinging ever more fiercely to their ritual. See, they told themselves, it is working, we have found a way to endure. Yet the reprieve was temporary, a fragile illusion. Death, as always, was patient. When the curse struck again, it did so with vengeance. One generation lost 3 siblings within a single year, their coffins found sealed in the morning, though none had shut the lids. Another heir was discovered lifeless within his coffin, his face contorted in terror, as though something had joined him inside. Servants whispered that the coffins themselves had become prisons, that by imitating death too closely, the family had invited it in. But by then, there was no turning back. The dynasty was too bound to the ritual, too defined by it. To abandon the coffins would have been to admit defeat. Thus the practice continued, year after year, generation after generation, until it no longer seemed strange to them at all. For outsiders, it was madness. For the dynasty, it was life itself. They had crossed the threshold where survival and surrender became indistinguishable, and as the years dragged on, their identity fused with the image of the coffin, until they were no longer lords and ladies, no longer patrons or rulers, but living corpses, drifting through history in velvet-lined tombs, alive in body but dead in spirit. To us, the image of a living person lying in a coffin feels unnatural, grotesque, even insane. But in the world of the dynasty, it was not without precedent. Folklore is thick with stories of people who sought to cheat death by imitating it, and the coffin was simply the most extreme expression of that belief. To understand why the family embraced such a ritual, we must step beyond their walls and into the vast landscape of European superstition, a place where the line between life and death was always thin, where people clung to symbols and rituals to shield themselves from forces they could not see. Across cultures, the idea of mock death has long been tied to survival. In some parts of Europe, it was believed that those who pretended to die could confuse malevolent spirits, tricking them into passing by. The Grim Reaper, like a tax collector, was thought to claim only what was due. If a person lay still, silent, cold as stone, perhaps death would assume its task already complete. There are recorded folk practices where villagers laid the sick in shallow graves or covered them with funeral shrouds, not to kill them but to convince the spirit of illness to depart. For the dynasty, whose lives were already plagued by unexplained deaths, such logic must have seemed irresistible. The coffin itself carried even deeper symbolism. More than just a container for the dead, it was a threshold, a vessel between the world of the living and the afterlife. To climb inside one willingly was to symbolically surrender, to enact one's death in a way that might pacify whatever curse or spirit demanded it. Folklorists call this apotropaic magic, rituals designed not to undo evil, but to redirect it, to trick it into believing its work was done. Just as some cultures placed shoes, mirrors, or iron charms in graves to prevent the dead from rising, so too did the dynasty place themselves in coffins to prevent death from coming. There are even earlier echoes of the practice. In ancient Greece, some cults practiced ritual death and rebirth, sealing initiates in dark chambers where they lay as if dead before being brought out to symbolically rise again. In Slavic folklore, people sometimes staged mock funerals for the gravely ill, believing that by ritually burying them, death itself would lose interest. And in medieval Europe, monks spoke of the memento mori, the constant reminder of mortality, keeping skulls and coffins close at hand as spiritual tools. The dynasty's practice, extreme as it seems, was a twisted evolution of beliefs already woven into European thought. Yet the coffin carried another layer of meaning, darker still. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was gripped by fear of the revenant, the restless dead who returned to haunt the living. Villages across Eastern Europe told stories of corpses rising from graves, drinking blood, spreading disease. These tales became the roots of vampire mythology, and with them came rituals to prevent such creatures, staking corpses through the heart, placing stones in their mouths, even burying them face down. The coffin, in this context, was not just a bed of death, but a prison for the dangerous dead. To see a living family willingly place themselves inside one blurred the boundary between human and monster. Were they protecting themselves from revenants, or becoming revenants themselves? Contemporary observers certainly thought so. Rumors spread that the dynasty was not merely cursed, but tainted, sliding toward vampirism. Their nightly coffin ritual became evidence. They lie as the dead, but rise again, one pamphlet proclaimed. What else could they be but the living damned? In villages nearby, children were warned not to wander too close to the estate, lest they be taken in the night. Servants whispered of seeing their masters pale and gaunt in the morning, their eyes sunken, their skin cold, as though the coffins had stolen more life than they preserved. But others interpreted the ritual differently. Some argued the dynasty's coffin sleeping was a form of penance, a nightly confession of guilt. Perhaps they believed their ancestors had indeed committed sins worthy of divine wrath, and lying in coffins was their attempt at humility, a way of saying to God, "We accept our deaths, If only you might delay them a little longer. To these observers, the ritual was not vampiric but monastic, a morbid evolution of the Mori, carried to its most literal extreme. And then there were those who saw the coffins as talismans of control. In a world where death struck without warning, fevers, plagues, accidents, the coffin was at least something tangible. To climb inside one was to reclaim agency, to say, if death is inevitable, then let me choose the hour, the posture, the bed. For a dynasty stripped of power by misfortune, the coffin may have felt like the only thing they could commemorate. Folklore, superstition, religion, fear, all of it converged in those nightly rituals. But the most haunting question remains, did it work? For a time the answer seemed to be yes. As the dynasty embraced the coffin practice, deaths slowed. Some heirs lived longer than expected. Some lines extended where once they would have ended. This only reinforced the belief. The coffins were not madness, they were protection. But folklore is filled with bargains that offer temporary relief at terrible cost. In tricking death, the dynasty may have convinced themselves they were safe. In reality, they had bound themselves ever more tightly to the curse, becoming inseparable from it in the minds of all who heard their story. The coffin had become more than furniture, more than ritual. It was identity. The dynasty ceased to be remembered as rulers, warriors, or patrons of art. They became the coffin sleepers, the family who rehearsed death, the living dead who stalked their own halls. In the eyes of outsiders, their fate was sealed. They were no longer just cursed. They were symbols, warnings, phantoms made flesh. And as centuries passed, their story merged with the broader body of folklore. To some, they were a case study in superstition, evidence of how far fear could drive the human mind. To others they were a chilling confirmation of the supernatural, that curses were real, that coffins could trap more than corpses, that even the wealthy and powerful could not escape the reach of death. The dynasty in the end did not merely practice superstition, they became superstition. They became legend. By daylight, the dynasty's estate looked like any other seat of noble power. The towers rose against the horizon, banners fluttered, servants bustled about the courtyards. But as dusk fell, the atmosphere shifted. The house did not prepare itself for rest in the way other homes did. No firelit laughter, no soft bedding being drawn, no children lulled to sleep by song. Instead, the household prepared itself for death. The very architecture of the estate began to reflect its owner's obsession. Corridors stretched long and narrow like crypt passages. Windows were shuttered early, sealing out the twilight. Heavy curtains smothered the rooms, swallowing light before it could soften the gloom. The scent of beeswax and incense hung thick in the air, disguising but never quite erasing the odor of wood polish and velvet, the coffin scent that clung to everything. Servants whispered that one could never forget, even for a moment, that this was not just a manor but a mausoleum for the living. Bedrooms were the most striking transformation. No beds stood there, no feather mattresses, no canopies draped with silk. Instead, each chamber contained a coffin, handcrafted, polished, lined with velvet. Some were left open, inviting their owners in, as though they were luxury beds with grotesque proportions. Others bore half-closed lids, leaving only a sliver of space for air and candlelight. In some rooms, crucifixes hung above the coffins. In others, charms were tucked into corners, garlic, sprigs of rosemary, even small mirrors facing inward, as though to repel whatever might creep out from the coffin rather than into it. The nightly ritual was carried out with eerie precision. Servants, if they dared remain in service, prepared the coffins at dusk. They would smooth the velvet linings, light candles in the hallways, and place rosaries or small relics within reach. Then the members of the dynasty would enter, one by one, their footsteps echoing softly as they walked to their chambers. Some performed small gestures, signs of the cross, whispered prayers, or in darker accounts, muttered incantations in languages the servants claimed not to know. And then came the silence, the creak of wood, the faint sigh of breath, and the household became as still as the grave. For outsiders, this was the most shocking part. Not that the family slept in coffins, but that they did so every single night, without fail. Even when guests were present, even when dignitaries dined with them, the ritual could not be broken. Imagine sitting at their table, dining on roasted meats and rich wines, while knowing that within the hour, your hosts would retreat not to featherbeds, but to coffins. Some guests feigned illness to avoid staying overnight. Others, driven by morbid curiosity, insisted on witnessing the transition, only to flee before dawn, shaken by the stillness that gripped the estate after midnight. The servants, of course, bore the worst of it. Those who stayed often confessed to living in constant fear. To tend to a noble's bedchamber was to stand before a coffin and pretend it was a bed. To wake a master in the morning meant approaching that coffin and listening for breath, unsure if the one inside still lived. Many refused to enter after nightfall, and some estates employed only the most desperate, those willing to endure the terror for the sake of coin. The more superstitious swore that at times, faint scratching noises could be heard within the coffins during the night, though whether it came from restless nobles shifting in their sleep or from something else, they dared not say. And yet, daily life continued. By morning, the dynasty would emerge from their coffins, don their finery, and conduct affairs like any other noble house. They attended mass, hosted councils, entertained guests, and managed their estates, but their pallor betrayed them. Pale faces, shadowed eyes, cold hands, they moved slowly, deliberately, as though part of them remained in the coffins, even while awake. Some chroniclers remarked that their laughter never rang quite true, that their smiles carried the stiffness of masks. They were alive, but they bore the weight of death with them wherever they went. Children of the dynasty grew up steeped in this strange duality. By day they played in courtyards, learned letters, and studied music, but by night they too were placed in small coffins, taught to fold their arms across their chests, to lie still and quiet. It was discipline and indoctrination in one. What was meant to be a survival strategy became identity. To these children, the coffin was as natural as a cradle. The terror belonged not to them, but to the outsiders who saw what they could not, an entire lineage rehearsing its own burial. The villagers, of course, spun endless stories about life inside the estate. Some said the nobles never emerged during daylight, that they avoided the sun entirely and lived like vampires. Others swore they fed on blood, explaining their pallor and frailty. In truth, the dynasty often appeared at church, at markets, at courts, yet the coffin legend eclipsed all else. A noble might sit in the front pew of mass, dressed in gold and lace, but the whispers behind them always returned to the same refrain: "There goes the coffin sleeper." In the broader culture, the estate itself became infamous. Travelers wrote of it in hushed tones, describing it as a house without beds, a place where laughter died in the halls, where every room smelled faintly of cedar and wax. Some accounts describe visiting artists who found inspiration in its atmosphere, creating dark portraits and Gothic verses. Others speak of priests who attempted exorcisms, sprinkling holy water on the coffins, only to be politely dismissed by the family. The dynasty accepted their fate, even their infamy, with a kind of grim dignity. Over time, the estate itself seemed to absorb the character of its inhabitants. Walls darkened, windows remained shuttered, gardens grew wild and untended. Visitors remarked that the house appeared abandoned, even when it was full of life. It was as if the building too had been cursed to rehearse its own decay, caught between grandeur and ruin. And yet, despite its bleakness, the household remained strangely alluring. Writers, travelers, even nobles from other lands came to see it, to glimpse the infamous coffin sleepers. Some were horrified, others were fascinated, but none could forget it. The dynasty had transformed their home into a theater of death, and every night was another performance, each family member an actor rehearsing the same role. In this way, the Gothic household became both prison and stage. It trapped the family in ritual, but it also immortalized them. They no longer needed to rule vast lands or command armies to be remembered. Their legend was written in velvet-lined coffins, in whispered tales of living corpses, in the haunting silence of a house that slept as the dead. The dynasty may have been secretive, but secrecy never lasts forever. Word of their strange ritual leaked beyond the estate walls, whispered first among servants, then in nearby villages, and finally across entire regions. What had begun as local rumor grew into something larger, a story of nobles who slept in coffins like the dead. And as the legend spread, outsiders arrived, drawn by a mix of fascination, horror, and duty. Some came as priests, hoping to drive away whatever evil plagued the family. Others came as chroniclers, seeking to record the bizarre, and a few came simply to gawk at the spectacle, leaving with stories that blurred fact and imagination until they were indistinguishable. One of the earliest surviving accounts comes from a Jesuit priest who claimed to have been invited to the estate in the early 17th century. His letters, preserved in fragments, describe an atmosphere thick with silence and dread, a household that seemed to prepare for death each night. He wrote of entering a noblewoman's chamber and finding her already lying in her coffin, rosary in hand, lips moving in frantic prayer. The priest attempted to bless the coffin, sprinkling holy water across the velvet lining, but the woman begged him to stop. "It is not the devil I fear," she said, "but the curse that hunts my blood. The coffin is my shield. Do not take it from me." The Jesuit left the estate unsettled, convinced the family's faith had been replaced by superstition, yet his writings betray something else, an unease, a sense that the ritual might indeed have held power. He admitted that after the blessing, the woman's health declined rapidly. Within weeks, she was dead. To the priest, this was proof of divine punishment for superstition. To the family, it was proof that abandoning the coffin meant certain death. Travelers, too, left vivid impressions. A German nobleman passing through the region described staying one night at the estate. He was shown to a chamber that contained no bed, only an ornate coffin. Believing it some form of jest, he laughed, until he realized the servants were serious. He refused to lie inside, and spent the night seated upright in a chair, listening to the silence that pressed against the walls. In the morning, he reported hearing faint scratching sounds during the night. Though whether they came from mice or from something within the coffins, he could not say. He departed at first light, writing later that he would never again enter a house where the dead sleep alongside the living. Not all visitors were so repelled. Some chroniclers seemed almost enchanted by what they witnessed. One French traveler, a minor poet, described the estate as a living theater of mortality. He claimed to have dined with the family and found them eloquent, melancholy, and strangely magnetic. Their pallor only added to their aura, their nightly ritual lending them an air of tragic romance. For him, the coffin sleepers were not monsters but martyrs, bearing their curse with dignity. He compared them to characters in Greek tragedy, doomed yet noble, forever suspended between life and death. His writings helped spread the dynasty's reputation into the realm of art and literature, ensuring they would be remembered not just as cursed, but as profoundly Gothic. The villagers, however, had no such romantic illusions. They told cruder, more frightening tales. Some claimed to have seen pale figures wandering the estate's grounds at night, their movements stiff and unnatural. Others swore that livestock sickened after the nobles had passed nearby, or that infants in surrounding villages fell ill when the dynasty hosted large gatherings. To them, the coffin ritual was not protection but corruption. "They are no longer ours." One villager was recorded as saying, "They live here, but they belong to the grave." Folklorists of later centuries would note that these accounts mirror vampire lore almost exactly. The coffin, the pale appearance, the nocturnal movements, the aura of sickness spreading to those nearby, all are features common to vampire legends that emerged in Eastern Europe during the same era. It is possible that the dynasty's ritual directly influenced such tales, transforming them from isolated superstition into widespread myth. Or perhaps the family, in embracing the coffin, simply stepped into a role that folklore was already waiting to assign them. Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from a physician who visited the estate in the mid-1600s. He had been summoned to treat one of the heirs, who had grown frail and pale. Upon entering the chamber, He was stunned to find the young man not in a bed, but in a coffin. The physician urged him to abandon such Gothic nonsense and sleep in a proper bed for the sake of his health. The heir refused, insisting that to leave the coffin would be to invite death. The physician recorded that the young man's pulse was faint and irregular, his breath shallow. Within days the heir died. When the doctor attempted to examine the body, the family prevented him, sealing the coffin shut before his eyes. He departed in fury, later publishing an account that accused the dynasty of hiding dark practices from the outside world. It was accounts like these, priests' warning of blasphemy, doctors' warning of madness, villagers' warning of vampirism, that cemented the dynasty's reputation. Each testimony, shaped by the witnesses' fears and beliefs, added another layer to the legend. The Jesuits' letters turned the story into one of superstition versus faith. The villagers' whispers turned it into a tale of monsters. The poets' verses transformed it into Gothic tragedy, and all the while, the family continued their ritual, undeterred by what outsiders thought. But if the family seemed indifferent to judgment, it is worth asking, why did they allow outsiders to see it all? Why not hide the practice? Some scholars suggest they believed their ritual was beyond shame, that to conceal it would dishonor their ancestors who had died by the curse. Others argue that they wanted outsiders to spread the tale, to amplify their legend, so that death itself might be tricked not only by coffins but by fear. After all, if enough people believed the dynasty already belonged to the grave, might not death itself be persuaded? Whatever their motives, the result was clear. The coffin sleepers entered history, not just through their own actions but through the eyes of others. They became a mirror for the fears of their age: fear of curses, fear of superstition, fear of vampirism, fear of decay. Each visitor left with a different story, and together those stories created a legend larger than the family itself. By the 18th century, long after the dynasty's power had waned, their legend endured. Travelers still sought out the estate, priests still invoked their name in sermons, and writers still drew inspiration from their bizarre ritual. The dynasty might have been fading, but their myth had already outlived them. In trying to cheat death, they had achieved something stranger. They had become immortal in story, bound forever to the image of nobles lying in coffins, living their lives as if they were already dead. For a time, the coffins seemed to work. Death had slowed its relentless march. Heirs survived longer, siblings reached adulthood, and a fragile sense of hope spread through the estate. It was whispered in the halls that perhaps the curse had grown weary, perhaps the ritual had confused it for good. But hope, when born in darkness, is fragile, and in the dynasty's case, it was short-lived. The first cracks appeared in the form of sudden, unexplained deaths. One heir, young, vigorous, barely past 20, was found lifeless in his coffin one morning. His face was contorted in terror, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream. There was no sign of illness, no injury, nothing the physicians could diagnose. Servants whispered that something had entered the coffin during the night, some presence that took him without leaving a mark. The family buried him quickly, but rumors spread faster than the funeral procession could reach the churchyard. The curse has returned, people muttered. The coffins no longer protect them. Soon after, tragedy struck again. 2 siblings, a brother and sister, were discovered dead in their chambers on the same night. Both lay in their coffins with their arms still neatly crossed, but their skin bore strange marks, bruises along the neck, faint scratches across their chests. No intruder had entered the estate, no servant confessed to foul play. Whatever had claimed them had done so silently, invisibly. For the dynasty, the message was clear. Their ritual was no longer enough. Panic spread through the household. Some family members doubled down, insisting the coffins must not only be slept in, but sealed tightly each night. Servants recoiled at this, fearing suffocation, but the dynasty persisted. Heirs demanded their lids be closed and fastened, leaving only small holes for air. In the mornings, when the coffins were opened, the survivors would emerge pale, drenched in sweat, trembling from nightmares. And sometimes they did not emerge at all. A lid would creak open to reveal another still body, lifeless in its velvet cradle. The villagers, already suspicious, saw these deaths as proof that the dynasty had crossed some forbidden threshold. Whispers of vampirism grew louder. Children dared each other to run near the estate walls, swearing they heard muffled cries from within at night. Farmers claimed the soil near the estate yielded poor harvests, as if cursed by proximity. And whenever livestock sickened or vanished, the coffin sleepers were blamed. "They are being taken one by one," the villagers said, "and what takes them will come for us next." Inside the estate, fear turned inward. Relatives accused one another of drawing the curse closer. Some claimed that particular branches of the family were tainted more deeply, that their bloodline carried the root of the evil. Paranoia spread. Meals grew tense, conversations clipped, glances sharp and mistrustful. The once grand household, already suffocating with silence, now trembled with suspicion. Coffins became prisons of both body and mind. And then came the most infamous incident, the story retold in countless pamphlets and sermons across Europe. An heir of notable importance, some say the direct successor to the family's title, was found dead in his coffin under circumstances too strange to ignore. His chamber had been locked from within. His coffin had been sealed as usual. Yet when servants opened it in the morning, his body was missing. The coffin lay empty, its velvet lining indented as though he had lain there. The family searched frantically, scouring every corner of the estate, but the heir was never found. Some whispered he had risen from the coffin and walked into the night, transformed into one of the restless dead. Others claimed the curse itself had devoured him, body and soul. Whatever the truth, the dynasty could not explain it. And from that moment, the whispers of vampirism solidified into certainty. Chroniclers of the time relished such accounts. Priests declared the family damned. Physicians spoke of unnatural wasting, afflictions that science could not name. Writers painted the dynasty as Gothic phantoms, their coffins symbols of both hubris and doom. What had once seemed eccentric now looked like blasphemy. They sought to trick death, one preacher thundered, but in so doing they invited it into their very beds. The coffins themselves began to feel less like shields and more like traps. Servants told of nobles waking in the night, thrashing, pounding against the lids, screaming to be released. Others described heirs who refused to enter the coffins at all, choosing instead to pace the halls until exhaustion forced them down in chairs or on stone floors. Yet even they did not escape. The curse found them regardless, striking with the same merciless precision. By the 18th century, the family's decline was irreversible. Successive generations dwindled, their numbers cut down by strange deaths, disappearances, and sudden illnesses. Each new burial was another confirmation of the curse's grip. The estate grew emptier, corridors falling silent, gardens overgrown, coffins stacked like relics in rooms where no living person remained. Visitors who came seeking the infamous coffin sleepers often found not Gothic grandeur but ruin, a place where echoes of ritual lingered, but life itself had nearly vanished. And still the legend of their nightly practice endured. Even as the coffins failed them, they clung to the ritual. For them to abandon it was unthinkable. It was their only identity, the last fragile link to survival. Death might claim them, but at least they would die within the only defense they had ever known. The curse, once a shadow that haunted the family, had by then consumed them entirely. Whether it was divine punishment, ancient vengeance, or nothing more than a tragic inheritance of disease and superstition, one truth remained: the dynasty had lost. The coffins that once promised protection became the symbols of their doom, and as the family withered into memory, it was not their titles, their lands or their achievements that survived. It was the image of nobles lying in coffins, night after night, rehearsing their own deaths until the final curtain fell. Legends have a way of swallowing the truth. The more strange and terrifying a tale becomes, the more it grows beyond its origins, leaving behind only fragments of what actually happened. The dynasty of the coffin sleepers is no exception. By the time their story had traveled across Europe, it had become impossible to tell where fact ended and imagination began. Were they truly cursed? Did they really lie in coffins every night? Or were these details the inventions of fearful villagers and sensationalist chroniclers eager to sell their stories? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the murk between. Let us begin with what can be verified. Records confirm that a noble family in the region did suffer an unusually high rate of early deaths. Parish registers list funerals occurring year after year, often for heirs barely out of childhood or adults struck down in their prime. Diseases were common in those centuries: plague, consumption, fevers. But even by those grim standards, the dynasty's losses stood out. Neighbors remarked on their misfortune, priests noted it in sermons, and officials in distant courts whispered that their bloodline seemed unlucky. This much is fact: their mortality rate was real, and it was staggering. But what of the coffins? Here the waters grow murkier. Some contemporary chroniclers do mention the practice of coffin sleeping. The Jesuit letters, the physician's angry notes, the traveler's anecdotes, these exist, though scholars debate their accuracy. Were these accounts honest descriptions of what the witnesses saw, or were they exaggerations designed to shock their audiences? After all, in a time when pamphlets and letters spread stories like wildfire, the more grotesque the tale, the faster it traveled. A family plagued by illness was tragic, but a family that chose to lie in coffins each night, that was unforgettable. There are hints that the truth may have been less dramatic. Some historians suggest the dynasty may not have literally slept in coffins, but in coffin-like beds, wooden frames with lids or shutters, designed for warmth and privacy. Such beds did exist in parts of Europe, particularly in colder regions. Over time, as the family's curse became a topic of gossip, these beds may have been reimagined in the popular imagination as coffins. What began as a practical solution could easily have been twisted into a macabre legend. And yet, the sheer number of independent testimonies makes it difficult to dismiss the coffin story entirely. Too many voices, across too many decades, describe the same thing: nobles lying in coffins, their chambers resembling crypts. Even if exaggeration played its part, it seems likely that some version of the ritual was real. Perhaps not every family member practiced it, perhaps not every night, but enough to embed the image in collective memory. Then there is the question of the curse itself. Was it supernatural or biological? Modern researchers have suggested possible medical explanations. Some point to genetic disorders that could have shortened lifespans dramatically, such as certain blood diseases or congenital conditions. Others note that tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was rampant in noble households, where close quarters and poor ventilation helped it spread. Its symptoms, pallor, weight loss, coughing blood, would have only fueled vampire rumors. Another possibility is porphyria, a rare condition that can cause severe sensitivity to light, disfigurement, and other strange symptoms. Later vampire legends have often been retroactively linked to porphyria, and though the connection is debated, it offers a tantalizing explanation for why the dynasty might have avoided sunlight, looked pale, and seemed unearthly to villagers. If true, the coffin ritual may have been a symbolic way of coping with illness, an attempt to gain control over what they could not cure. Religious politics also played a role in shaping their legend. At the height of the dynasty's decline, Europe was riven by conflict between Catholic and Protestant factions. To accuse a noble family of unholy rituals was a powerful weapon in propaganda wars. Pamphlets describing coffin sleepers may have been sharpened by religious bias, casting them as examples of God's wrath or the devil's influence depending on the author's agenda. Thus, their nightly ritual, whether real or imagined, became ammunition in battles far larger than their estate. But the myths proved more powerful than any historical reality. Over time, the details grew darker, more elaborate. In some versions of the tale, the family were outright vampires, rising from their coffins to drink the blood of peasants. In others, they were necromancers, using the coffins to commune with the dead. Still others painted them as tragic figures who lay in coffins to bear the burden of their ancestors' sins. The further the story spread, the less it mattered what the dynasty had actually done. What mattered was what they symbolized: the thin line between life and death, and the terror of being trapped between the two. And this is perhaps the most haunting truth of all. In seeking to escape their curse, the dynasty created a legend that ensured they would never truly escape it. Even centuries later, historians, folklorists, and storytellers cannot separate the family from their coffins. Whether they actually slept in them or not almost doesn't matter anymore. The myth has devoured the reality. We may never know the exact details. Perhaps there were coffins, perhaps only coffin-like beds. Perhaps the deaths were caused by illness, perhaps by something more mysterious. But the ambiguity is what keeps the story alive. For every historian who insists on a medical explanation, there is a folklorist who insists the supernatural cannot be dismissed. For every skeptic who sees propaganda, there is a storyteller who sees tragedy. In the end, the dynasty achieved a strange kind of immortality. Not the physical immortality they may have sought through their rituals, but the immortality of myth. The world remembers them not for their titles, their estates, or their achievements, but for the haunting image of nobles lying in coffins, trying to trick death and failing. They became a legend so potent that even now, centuries later, it still chills the imagination. Legends rarely die with the families that spawn them. If anything, they grow stronger as the years pass, slipping free from their historical roots and seeding themselves into culture, art, and imagination. The dynasty of the coffin sleepers may have faded into obscurity, their estate collapsing into ruin, and their bloodline dwindling to nothing, but their story survived, and in many ways thrived. For what they left behind was not just tragedy, but imagery so powerful it became the foundation of Gothic horror itself. The image of a nobleman lying in a coffin, pale and silent, neither fully alive nor truly dead, became one of the most enduring motifs of European folklore. For peasants and villagers, the family's nightly ritual blurred into the rising tide of vampire superstition that swept the continent in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the Balkans, corpses were staked and burned out of fear they might return. In Austria, officials documented entire communities convinced of vampiric attacks, and in whispers that reached further west, the story of the coffin sleepers fed into this growing paranoia. Not only did vampires rise from their coffins, but here was a family that willingly chose to sleep in them while alive. It was a perfect inversion of the natural order. For ordinary people, the coffin was the end, a box to contain the dead and separate them from the living. To see nobles, figures already distant, powerful, and strange, embrace the coffin as part of daily life was both shocking and terrifying. "They are already half dead," the villagers muttered, "and that is why death clings to them." From this seed, the dynasty's tale merged seamlessly with vampiric lore, ensuring it would never vanish from Europe's imagination. By the 18th century, the dynasty's ritual had already become the stuff of pamphlets and plays. Writers of the time, ever hungry for the macabre, used the image of the coffin sleeper as a symbol of decadent nobility, families who in their pride and secrecy placed themselves closer to the grave than to God. Such portrayals blurred history with morality tale, presenting the dynasty not merely as cursed, but as punished. The coffin became an emblem of sin, a nightly reminder that one cannot escape divine judgment. Then came the Gothic Age. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe fell under the spell of Gothic literature, a world of haunted castles, crumbling dynasties, and aristocrats touched by darkness. The story of the coffin sleepers fit this genre like a glove. Though rarely named directly, echoes of their ritual appeared in countless novels and poems. Consider John Polidori's The Vampire 1819, often cited as the birth of the modern vampire in English literature. Its aristocratic villain, Lord Ruthven, carries many traits that could have been inspired by whispered tales of coffin-haunting nobles. Or look to Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla 1872, where the intimacy of the coffin, the claustrophobic sense of death brushing against life, pulses at the heart of the story. And of course Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, immortalized the vampire's coffin as his nightly resting place. Was Stoker directly inspired by the dynasty? Perhaps not. But by his time, the motif of nobles and coffins had already been cemented in Europe's collective imagination, an imagination the coffin sleepers helped shape. Even outside of fiction, the dynasty's imagery endured. Painters and illustrators embraced the Gothic allure of coffins. Woodcuts and engravings from the 18th century show aristocrats lying stiffly in ornate boxes, blurring the line between deathbed and bedroom. Later, in the Romantic period, artists turned the coffin into a symbol of tragic beauty, a stage upon which doomed figures enacted their slow decline. In each brushstroke, we glimpse the dynasty's influence, the idea that nobility and death are intertwined, that wealth and grandeur cannot shield one from the grave. But their legacy is not only artistic, it is psychological. The dynasty of the coffin sleepers tapped into one of humanity's deepest fears, premature burial. In the 17th and 18th centuries, fear of being buried alive was widespread. Coffins with air holes, bells, and escape mechanisms were even patented. Against this backdrop, a family choosing to sleep in coffins nightly felt like a grotesque inversion of the era's terror. Where most people dreaded the coffin, the dynasty embraced it. That choice, whether real or exaggerated, ensured their place in the collective subconscious as figures both horrifying and incomprehensible. This same imagery resonates in modern horror cinema. When we see Dracula resting in his coffin in a black and white film, or when modern vampires slip into their caskets at dawn, we are not just seeing fiction. We are seeing the echo of a centuries-old dynasty that once lay down each night in coffins of their own. Even if history cannot confirm every detail, the story lives on through the archetype it helped birth. Yet their legacy is more than just vampires. The dynasty also influenced broader themes in Gothic lore: the cursed bloodline, the decaying estate, the family trapped in rituals they cannot abandon. Every haunted house story, where heirs inherit not wealth but doom, owes something to them. Every cursed family saga where the sins of ancestors weigh on the present carries a shadow of their fate. Their legend is not confined to the coffin. It stretches into the very DNA of Gothic storytelling. Even today, the dynasty's story refuses to rest. Ghost tours, local legends, and internet forums still trade in whispers about them. Some claim their coffins remain in crumbling estates, lined in velvet, waiting for curious explorers to open them. Others believe the curse never truly ended, that descendants in distant lands still carry the taint, still haunted by nightmares of waking in coffins. Whether true or not, the persistence of such rumors proves the power of their legacy. In the end, the dynasty that slept in coffins did achieve a kind of immortality, not the flesh and blood immortality that eluded them, but the immortality of symbol. They became more than people. They became archetypes, and archetypes never die. They linger, shifting their shape, appearing in novels, in films, in art, in nightmares. When we imagine vampires resting in their coffins, when we envision cursed families trapped by fate, when we shiver at the thought of lying in a box and waiting for dawn, we are walking in the shadow of their story. The dynasty's name may be forgotten, their graves unmarked, their estates in ruins, but the world remembers the image they left behind: nobles lying down in coffins each night, rehearsing their deaths until those rehearsals became reality. And in that image they live on forever, part of the dark tapestry of Gothic lore. When a dynasty falls, one might expect its memory to crumble alongside its stone halls and neglected gardens. Yet for the coffin sleepers, death was not an ending, but a transformation. Their story seeped into the soil, into the whispers of villagers, into the folklore that lingered long after the estate had fallen silent. And to this day, their presence is said to haunt the lands they once ruled. In the villages surrounding the ruined estate, stories still circulate, tales told by grandparents to children beside fires, warnings whispered to travelers who wander too close to the overgrown grounds. The most enduring of these legends is simple. If you pass near the ruins on a moonless night, you may hear the sound of coffin lids creaking open. Some claim to have heard muffled knocks from beneath the earth, as though the dead themselves are still trying to rise. Others swear they've seen pale figures walking through the woods, their movements stiff, their eyes vacant, like nobles trapped in eternal sleepwalking. One popular tale tells of a farmer who, late at night, attempted to cut through the estate's abandoned orchards. As he passed, he noticed rows of old wooden boxes stacked near a crumbling wall. Thinking them discarded furniture, he reached to pry one open, only for the lid to slam shut on its own. Terrified, he fled, and when he returned the next morning with others, the boxes were gone. It was the sleepers, the villagers said, watching him as he passed. Whether true or not, the orchard remains a place no farmer willingly plows, its fruit left to rot where it falls. There are also stories of strange dreams. Residents living near the ruins report waking with the sensation of lying in a confined space, their arms crossed over their chests, unable to move. Some describe waking with shallow breaths, convinced for a moment that they are suffocating. Local superstition holds that these dreams are the curse reaching out, that the spirits of the coffin sleepers pull the living into their nightly ritual, forcing others to experience the terror they once endured. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators have not resisted the lure of such tales. Over the last century, the estate's ruins have become a magnet for those chasing the uncanny. Teams have reported recording unexplained noises, rhythmic thumps resembling the sound of fists on wood, sudden drops in temperature, and distorted voices on audio equipment. In one case, an investigator swore he captured the sound of a whisper repeating the word "open." Skeptics dismiss such findings as imagination and interference, but believers see them as proof that the coffin sleepers never truly left. Legends also tell of a cursed object, an heirloom said to have belonged to the dynasty. Some say it was a jeweled crucifix, others an ornate coffin key. According to folklore, anyone who possesses this relic begins to suffer the same fate as the family: sleepless nights, wasting sickness, and dreams of being buried alive. There are whispered accounts of collectors who obtained pieces of furniture from the estate, only to return them after weeks of misfortune. Whether these items truly existed or not, the idea of a cursed relic adds a further layer of dread to the dynasty's story. Religious folklore paints an even darker picture. Some old sermons describe the family as damned for abandoning God, claiming their nightly ritual was a pact with death itself. According to these accounts, the estate grounds are hallowed not by sanctity, but by despair, and no consecrated burial could ever undo the curse. Priests of later centuries, when shown the ruins, warned parishioners never to disturb the soil, for the earth here does not forgive, one recorded in his journal. Such warnings only deepened the aura of fear around the site. But perhaps the most chilling stories come from those who claim to have seen the sleepers themselves. In the 20th century, a group of travelers reported passing the ruins at dusk. They described seeing faint candlelight in the upper windows of the manor, though the house had long since collapsed inside. Through the broken glass they swore they glimpsed figures in old-fashioned garb lying in boxes, perfectly still, their faces waxen in the candlelight. When they returned the next day, there was nothing but rubble and silence. Even today, the lore continues to evolve in modern retellings. On internet forums and paranormal podcasts, people share stories of visiting the ruins, posting grainy photographs where shapes seem to emerge from the shadows. Some claim to hear whispers on recordings taken in the nearby woods. Others insist that sleeping near the ruins brings the same coffin dreams, visions of velvet-lined boxes and suffocating silence. Whether coincidence, psychology, or something unexplainable, the reports never cease. For the locals, however, the coffin sleepers are not entertainment. They are caution. Children are warned not to play near the ruins, lest the curse follow them home. Farmers avoid the land, even when fertile, muttering that nothing good grows where the sleepers once lay. Every few years a new story emerges: a hunter who vanished in the woods, a traveler who returned pale and sickly after wandering near the estate, a tourist who woke from nightmares too vivid to describe. And each time the explanation is the same: the curse still breathes. It is telling that centuries after their decline, the dynasty is remembered less for who they were than for what they represent. Their story has become a local mythology, a way for communities to explain misfortune, to bind their fears into a narrative that gives shape to the unknown. In life, the family was marked by tragedy. In death, they became symbols of dread, and symbols have far longer lives than flesh and bone. The coffins, once a desperate ritual of protection, are now eternal in the imagination. They creak open in stories told by candlelight. They appear in dreams, in blurred photographs, in the rustle of leaves outside ruined walls. They remain, even if only as memory. The dynasty may have perished, but their folklore lives on, as strong and unsettling as the night they first chose to sleep inside the boxes that promised salvation and delivered only despair. In the end, what remains of the dynasty that slept in coffins? Not their wealth, long squandered, not their titles, erased by time, not even their estate, now a hollow shell of stone and ivy. What endures is their story, a tale of desperation and dread that lingers in the human imagination like the echo of a tolling bell. To understand their legacy, one must first confront the coffin itself. For most of us, the coffin is the final object we encounter, a container that represents silence, stillness, and the end of earthly striving. It is not meant to be touched by the living, let alone embraced nightly as a bed. The dynasty inverted this universal truth. By sleeping in coffins, they blurred the line between the living and the dead, between ritual and reality. They became symbols not just of death, but of humanity's most ancient fear, that no matter what we do, death will always find us. And yet, there is something strangely human in their ritual. To lie down in a coffin each night was, in its own way, an act of resistance. It was a way of saying, if death is coming for me, I will meet it on my own terms. The coffins were prisons, yes, but also shields, a desperate attempt to outwit fate. There is tragedy in that image, but also defiance. Perhaps that is why their story resonates so deeply. We see in them our own fear of mortality and our futile attempts to escape it. History, of course, offers explanations. Diseases like tuberculosis, genetic disorders, and social isolation may account for the dynasty's decline. The coffin ritual may have been misunderstood beds, exaggerated by gossip, or warped by religious propaganda. Rational minds can strip the tale down to medical and cultural roots. And yet, even the most rational explanation cannot banish the power of the imagery. Coffins are too universal, too final, too symbolic. Once the idea took hold that nobles chose to lie in their own coffins, it was destined to outlive the family itself. But myths are not simply distortions of history, they are mirrors of human truth. Whether or not the dynasty literally slept in coffins, their story tells us something profound about the time in which they lived and about ourselves. It shows how fear can shape lives, how rituals can become prisons, and how families can carry the weight of curses both real and imagined. It also shows how we, centuries later, remain drawn to the darkness. We tell their story, not because we crave facts, but because we crave meaning. Consider the way their legend bleeds into vampire lore, into gothic fiction, into ghost stories still told today. In those tales, the dynasty achieves the immortality that eluded them in life. They live on in every creaking coffin lid in a horror film, in every aristocratic vampire reclining in velvet, in every whispered tale of cursed families who cannot escape their fate. Whether they wished it or not, the coffin sleepers became part of our cultural memory. And memory, unlike flesh, does not decay. Yet there is a deeper reflection here, one that reaches beyond folklore and superstition. Their story forces us to ask, how do we confront death? Do we, like the dynasty, attempt to hide from it, surrounding ourselves with rituals and symbols in the hope of safety? Or do we accept it, facing the inevitable with open eyes? The coffin sleepers chose the first path, and for that, they became legends. But perhaps their greatest gift is the question they leave behind, the mirror they hold up to us. Because in truth, we are not so different from them. We too create rituals to ward off the unknown. We cling to science, to faith, to routine, to tradition, all in an effort to make sense of life's one certainty. The The dynasty's coffins may seem extreme, even grotesque, but in them we see an amplified version of our own denial, our own fear, our own yearning for control. And this is why their story unsettles us still. It is not just a ghost story, not just a Gothic curiosity. It is a parable of mortality. To lie each night in a coffin is to live with death so closely that it becomes a companion. And whether we admit it or not, death is our companion too, following us from the moment we are born. The coffin sleepers simply chose to acknowledge it in the most literal, most haunting way imaginable. So when we speak of them now, when we whisper of their curse, or thrill at their influence on vampire myths, or shiver at tales of hauntings near their ruined estate, we are not only telling their story, we are telling our own. We are giving voice to our universal fear, dressing it in velvet and wood, and laying it down in the coffin beside us. The dynasty is gone, but the questions remain. Were they cursed, or simply unlucky? Did they embrace coffins as a ritual, or were the stories exaggerated? Did they find peace in their nightly practice, or only despair? We cannot know. But perhaps that uncertainty is the very essence of their legend. The mystery is what keeps them alive. And so, centuries later, the coffin sleepers have achieved what they sought: a form of immortality, not of flesh, not of blood, but of story. They live on every time we imagine them lowering themselves into coffins, crossing their arms, and waiting for dawn. They live on in our nightmares, in our ghost stories, in the Gothic shadows of our imagination. When the final lid closed over the last of their line, the dynasty may have thought their curse was complete, but in truth, their final rest was never theirs to claim. For as long as we tell their story, as long as we wonder what truly happened in those candlelit chambers, the coffin sleepers will never truly rest. They will remain with us, eternal, lying quietly in the coffins of our minds. The story of the coffin sleepers does not end with their extinction. History has a way of leaving echoes, faint but persistent, reverberating through centuries until they blur the line between the past and the present. And when we speak of this dynasty today, when we walk the ruins they once inhabited, or when we whisper their tale by firelight, we are, in some sense, awakening those echoes. The ruins of their estate still stand, or rather, what little remains of it. Ivy covers broken walls, staircases rise to nowhere, and what were once grand halls are now open to the wind. Yet visitors report a silence that feels unnatural, as though sound itself is muffled here. Birds rarely roost in the stonework, and animals skirt the grounds. Some say it is coincidence, but others insist it is the lingering mark of the curse, that nature itself recoils from the memory of the coffin sleepers. Modern paranormal researchers often describe the ruins as a thin place, where the veil between life and death feels fragile. Some claim to sense presences moving through the broken corridors. Others tell of shadows that linger in photographs, shapes too human to dismiss. A few, more daring, have attempted to spend nights within the estate, setting up cameras and voice recorders. Their footage, though grainy and ambiguous, is filled with strange anomalies, flickers of light where none should be, distorted voices, sudden, inexplicable malfunctions. Skeptics call it hysteria. Believers call it proof. Either way, the fascination persists. But the echoes of the dynasty are not confined to the ruins alone. Their story has spread like a ghost across culture, resurfacing in the most unexpected places. In some Eastern European villages, where vampire folklore still clings tightly to the imagination, elders recount the tale of nobles who slept in coffins, as though it were their own local legend. In literature classes, their story is sometimes cited as a possible influence on Gothic tradition. In online forums, their name resurfaces whenever the subject of real vampires or cursed families is raised. Though the dynasty has no living heirs, their memory is very much alive, carried not by blood, but by fear. And perhaps this is the true curse: to be remembered not for who you were, but for what you became in the eyes of others. The coffin sleepers may once have been ordinary nobles, struggling against illness, loss, and superstition. But through the centuries, they were transformed into something monstrous, something otherworldly. They became symbols of everything humanity fears: death, decay, curses, the uncanny, and in that transformation, they lost their humanity. Their true selves are buried under layers of myth, and only the coffins remain. It is worth asking, why do we continue to tell their story? Why do we keep breathing life into their memory? Perhaps it is because their tale speaks to the questions we cannot escape. What is the boundary between life and death? Can rituals shield us from fate? Can a curse truly bind a family for generations, or do we create curses by believing in them? The coffin sleepers force us to stare into the void and confront what lies there. And whether we call it superstition, illness, or something darker, the void always stares back. But there is another dimension too, one not often spoken of. There is a tragedy in their story, yes, but also a strange beauty. To live every night in a coffin is to live with the awareness of mortality so vividly, so constantly, that life itself becomes fragile, precious, fleeting. Perhaps the dynasty's ritual was not only about escaping death, but also about understanding it, about rehearsing for the inevitable until the fear dulled and only acceptance remained. If so, their coffins were not prisons, but teachers. And yet, acceptance is not what their story inspires in us. It inspires dread. When we imagine them lying in velvet-lined coffins, candlelight flickering against pale faces, the air heavy with silence, we feel the weight of their choice pressing against our chests. We feel the coffin closing around us. Their story unsettles us because it forces us to consider what we would do in their place. Would we lie down in the box each night, convincing ourselves it offered protection? Or would we defy the ritual, even if it meant inviting death more swiftly? Neither answer is comfortable. Both lead us back to the same end. As the documentary closes, imagine standing at the ruins of their estate today. The night air is still, the moon shrouded in clouds. You walk through the overgrown path, your footsteps crunching against stone and dirt. Ahead lies what was once their great hall, now a hollow skeleton of stone. And in the shadows, you notice shapes, long rectangular depressions in the earth. Coffins, perhaps only collapsed foundations. But the mind races, imagining nobles lowering themselves into wooden boxes, whispering prayers, and closing their lids against the night. In that moment, the story becomes alive again. The coffin sleepers are not gone. They are here, in the silence, in the imagination, in the shiver that creeps along your spine. They are eternal, not in body, but in the echo of their tale. And so, the dynasty that sought to cheat death found something stranger. They found immortality, not the kind they desired, but the kind no one can escape. They live forever in the darkness of our stories, in the folklore of villages, in the pages of Gothic novels, in the haunting rituals of modern horror. The dynasty is gone, but their coffins remain open in our minds, waiting for us to peer inside. Perhaps in the end, this is the lesson they leave us, that we do not choose how we are remembered. The dynasty wished only to survive, but in their desperation, they created an image too powerful to fade. An image that became myth, myth that became legend, and legend that became eternal. And when you close your eyes tonight, lying still in your bed, you may wonder, are you so different from them? You too lie down in the dark, surrendering to the unknown, trusting that you will wake again with the dawn. And in that act, however ordinary, you mirror the coffin sleepers. For every bed is in some sense a coffin, every night is a rehearsal, and one day, as it did for them, the rehearsal will become the final performance. The dynasty is gone, their estate lies in ruins, their coffins are empty, and yet, their story endures, reminding us that death cannot be escaped, but it can be remembered. And sometimes memory is the most haunting curse of all.